well. Dave Dulio is the director of the Center for Civic Engagement and political science professor at Oakland University. Dave, nice to have you back in the program.
Thanks for having me back, Tom.
So what about that point that, Joe Biden claims he's the most pro-union president ever? Do union members feel that way? I mean, sure, maybe he aligns with the union leadership, the Sean Fain types and whatnot, but maybe not so much with the union members themselves?
Well, I think that's a question for many of those members, but there's no doubt that the tides seem to be shifting a little bit politically, and I think that we have to go back 8 years or so to the time when Donald Trump bursts on the scene politically and really communicates and messages to union workers who are receptive to his style of campaigning and the issues that he addressed. You think back to 2016 and 2020 as well. Trump goes to places like Macomb County and talks about manufacturing and talks about trade and bad trade deals, right? And that was very, very different from sort of Republican orthodoxy at the time, and it got those voters' attention, and he did pretty well with many of them.
Yeah, and that includes like the Teamsters, because they made a pretty significant donation to the Republican National Committee, really for the first time since way back. I think it was the George W. Bush 2004 days. So it's not just members. Maybe it's more leadership. What does that indicate about union leaderships? Maybe their confidence or lack thereof in the current administration.
Well, I think that it's an interesting point to reflect on. Maybe this disconnect between leadership and rank and file members, right? I think that and I'm certainly not involved in any of those conversations, but you wonder if those discussions between membership and leadership are not a little bit difficult these days.
Well, I talked to some members, and there's members on both sides of the aisle, different party preferences and whatnot. But one thing that I've heard more than once is that they don't like it when they're encouraged and sometimes seemingly forced into a position of advocating for Democratic policies that they disagree with. And some of them have been told you got to go out and campaign for this particular candidate. They're like, this is not part of my job, but they feel repercussions if they don't abide by that. That's got to be a turnoff, I would think, if some feel that kind of intimidation to campaign for something or someone they disagree with.
Oh, I can only imagine, right? I mean, that you're that not only turns you off to maybe the leadership in general, but that political position, and maybe even drives some people toward the other side, right? And I think we should be careful here to talk about how much of a shift we're talking. This is not an instance where we're seeing this massive flip in support from union membership favoring Democrats to now favoring Republicans, even a majority of them, right? But there's a big enough shift, potentially, to have great impact on outcomes, right? So in this election cycle, we could point to any number of important constituencies: union members, African Americans, Arab Americans, young people, that are important parts of the Democratic coalition, where small shifts in those groups, in terms of voting preference, can really make a big difference when it comes to who wins on Election Day. Yeah,
and you're right to point that out. It's not as if suddenly unions are all in on Republicans. They're not. There's just enough of a shift, like we're seeing. Is this a trend developing, like we're seeing maybe with some various voting blocks, including like some of the Hispanic Americans that are, more of them are kind of choosing a Republican path. They're not the majority yet, but same with the African American shift. There's something happening which is causing Democrats concern. I do wonder, like, how much of these, like, corruption investigations, especially with the many, that they've been looking into the UAW, even recently, like the Sean Fain types, how much has that impacted their, political policy positions, or maybe more so their political connections? Like, is some of the fallout from this, maybe some more of this kind of a trend towards pushing a little bit more Republican, is some of the fallout maybe from this corruption landing, do you think, on the Democratic Party and the candidates?
I think that's possible. I think we'd have to do a bit of a deeper dive to see how, what might draw some of those members to Republicans based on that particular issue. If it's, Republicans are standing up to that corruption and investigating it, that might be a spot where some members say, well, they're fighting for people like me. And I think, honestly, that's what it all comes down to is who do voters in whatever block we're talking about, who do voters think are going to stand up for people like them and advocate for policies that are going to benefit them and their life, their family's life moving forward.
Yeah. I do wonder, how they're feeling about some of this push from particularly the Democrats when you look at this push towards, the trend. Let's look at the UAW, for example, and how they would feel about this push rapidly towards electrification of their entire fleet of cars very, very quickly, and how much of that work would go overseas. And I wonder if that's having any impact in this regard as well.
Oh, I think it is, and I think you're seeing that with the Trump campaign and its messaging on auto issues in Michigan in this particular election cycle, and a lot of it is focused on EVs and the impact that's going to have on the auto industry broadly speaking here, but really importantly on auto workers and their families.
Well, so appreciate, as always, your perspective. It's an interesting aspect of this, among many, in this political year. Dave Dulio, Director of the Center for Civic Engagement and Political Science Professor at Oakland University. Dave, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom. Have a great